Okay, Alex, any announcements before we get started?
I'll do it in the end. We can just go right to
Okay.
start. Yeah.
So good afternoon, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well uh, on this Sunday afternoon. Let me just share my screen of the booklet. I'm hoping everyone's been able to follow along. As I noticed, and from this book that we're using, the Divyabodhanam book about the church history, about the growing church. A lot of it's very detailed in this book by V.C. Samuel Achen. And so there's a lot of content. Um, Unless you're very interested in history, sometimes it can get a little detailed or I don't want to say boring, but it gets nitty gritty. So and it's hard to teach effectively on a short schedule. After talking with Sando Shachen the other day, he was mentioning there's only I think we're hoping to wrap up the book in 5 days, in the 5 sessions. And I think this is our
Third
third
session. This is the
third one.
third session.
Yeah, so we have this one and then two more. So then I'm hoping to uh, divide it up so we can finish by that fifth session and also leave time for questions. So unlike I was doing before, I'm going to try to be more deliberate and kind of just going over the high points of each of the sections. And if you have questions, please let me know. And also hopefully, if you guys can read, if everyone can read on their own, and if they have questions, please do forward them to us, and I can try to answer them, because it's a lot of content to get done in the next 3 sessions. So I hope to do my best to get them done. And a lot of it, like I said, it's repetitive. They're not as, I would say, not necessary to know all these minor details, but it helps. Or not minor, but these very detailed oriented things like names, specific dates, some events versus more major events that have more impact. So I'm going to try to hopefully hit on those that are more impactful. I feel like uh, in directing us toward where we want to the current church, the modern church, but highlighting those things that help build up to that point. So last time we had concluded on Unit 2's Chapter 1 lesson. Thus, we had concluded regarding the Persian church. And hold on, I forgot the title of that one. Let me see one second. The title of that lesson was The Church of Persia and its Catholicate, right? And so it gave a basic history of the Church of Persia and how its connections to our church. And that's how it kind of Achen ended that lesson about the credibility of the account of how the Persian church has some authority, either be it Antiochian or Persian connection for the church in Malabar. And so today, beginning with lesson 2, we're going to be focusing a lot on the Persian connection and how it relates to our church in Kerala. Uh, our church, is it more connected with the Persian church, or is it some posit who want to show more strong connection to the Antiochian Patriarchate, more a Jacobite connection of our church during this time? And so we'll be presenting both sides, but the main thing is the main historical events or accounts or incidents that happened to kind of lead our church to show that there is a church uh, in there's a church uh, present in Kerala. That's the main thing. That's our main focus, is to show that it proves that there was a church in Kerala, or at least there, in a sense, there was, and it's either limited or to a greater or lesser value to the outside church outside of Kerala or outside of India. So the main thing, as it says in this lesson 2, it talks about we're going to be looking at the Persian record now, and how we look at how it connects to our church in uh, Kerala. The main thing is when you look at the kind of the history of the church in Persia. This begins, kind of around the time of the church in the church as a whole, after the Christ uh, passion, death, and resurrection, and then the growth of the church of the apostles into the early church. Most of it, when we read church history, any books really, and especially in English, or it's always in a Western context, or meaning from the Roman Empire, because that's where Christianity grew and became the official language, and where it kind of, as most people think of today, that's where Christianity really is. And then so outside of that, it's very limited, or our understanding of that is very limited. So the Church of Persia is outside the realm of the Roman Empire side of the history we know of Christianity, but they're connected because they're like I said last time, they're bordering empires. They're fighting against each other. There's different contacts and of good and bad, and so that all adds up. So when you look at the church in Persia, the Persian Empire is not Christian, and it's not. And at this point, it's not what we think today. It's not Islamic either. It's not. There's no Islam yet at this time. So there's different. The Persians at this time, which is basically what we think of, or present day Iran and Iraq is the Babylonian Empire kind of, and the Persians from Iran, current day Iran. They're leading with their own local languages, local religions. But the main key figure one, or the key religion that kind of um, that is kind of the more driving force for the Persian Empire is Zoroastrianism, which is kind of a worship of the sun or fire or light, different things. And that's kind of the more unifying one compared to anything else. And so depending on that emperor at the time, either allowing for just kind of like the Roman Empire or persecuting the Christian, people who are not of the same faith as the royal family and the majority of the people. And so that's what this first section is. The church of the foundation or the background of the church of the Christian church growing in the Persian Empire is one that is being persecuted and or being tolerated in this Persian context, and the main religion is this Zoroastrianism. And so we see the church growing though because of its being in close proximity to the Roman Empire, where Christianity is slowly growing and develop and growing fast. A lot of martyrs are being held, and then the towns that are on the border are growing with Christians as well, and through missionaries and the like. We see that the church is growing exponentially to the point where now there's Christian communities in the Persian Empire that's taking root, as Achen mentions. Slowly it takes root, and we get this account from Bar Ebra, where it says that as we said last time, the disciple, the apostle Mari, was assigned to be the bishop for Seleucia, which is one of the capital towns or cities within the Persian Empire. And so the church in Persia is growing, and they slowly have success, bishops succeeding them from that point forward, from this apostle Mari, who's been from the 12 apostles, and from St. Thomas being appointed to be bishop for that area and that region. And so that's where their church, the Persian church, gets their line of succession up until, as it says here, the 3rd century, where we see Mar Papa, which we'll see him later in the lesson. He is a kind of an important figure that comes in later when we talk about the formation of the church in Persia, particularly in relations to Nestorianism. As Achen mentions, there's different successors, and that slowly the church community in the Seleucia, which is one of the capitals or major cities within the Persian Empire, the church is slowly growing, and they continue to grow. And we have different names, it says, as it says, Habudi becomes a Catholicos, and then there says Seleucia of Erbil becomes and visits the capital. It has all these people showing all these things until we get Mar Papa, who's elevated to the seat of as the main metropolitan of the church. And so we focus on these bishops who are appointed in this major city, and when we get to this Mar Papa, we start getting we get the metropolitan or the bishop of this major city in Persia, in Seleucia, in the city of Seleucia. He now claims leadership over the entire Church of Persia, no longer just of the city and the surrounding areas of the city, but showing, because it's one of the capitals of the Persian Empire, having jurisdiction, or at that time it's the capital of the Persian Empire, having full jurisdiction over the church as a whole within the Persian empire borders. And so it says, as Papa claims leadership over the entire church, was the beginning of the Seleucian Catholicate. So that's the first time we hear this term Catholicate, or the Catholicos, as meaning he's the overall bishop, or as we know, like the word Catholic, doesn't mean necessarily just Roman Church, but the word Catholic in Greek means the universal overall person when it refers to a person, a title for a person. So the Catholicos is the overall head of that region or that area, or in this case, this empire. And so we have to be mindful that this is a natural development of the churches in different regions. Even within the Roman Empire, we see the bishops of the major cities, be it Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, bishops in these major cities or capital cities within these empires take greater roles. And so just like these patriarchates of the Roman Empire become major bishops in charge, are considered the overall leader for a defined larger region with bishops under him. The same thing happens within the Persian Empire, within and then we see the first claim, or the first person using this title of Catholicos, or being the universal head of the area, is this Mar Papa. So when we look at how this comes to be, we notice Achen giving in the booklet, it gives us some detailed work about how the monarchs of the Persian Empire, as we said, are worshippers of the Zoroastrian religion, and in different times and in varying degrees, Christianity was allowed to function as a secondary religion, but under certain conditions. They're allowed to function kind of just like when we think of Christians during living under Muslim rule, and they allow for Christians to live in a similar way. They learned that from the previous, religious leadership, which is the Zoroastrian, where they are allowing for Christians to be there, but under very certain conditions. And one of those conditions was that they had to have an acknowledged leader, that the Zoroastrian leadership could go to speak for all of them. And so that's why when Mar Papa takes this title, he's taking this lead, or taking the opportunity, seizing this opportunity that's been given by the government, that they're looking for a person to be acknowledged as the overall person to represent all the Christians of the empire. And so he takes it upon himself. So then that's the first time that they see that they organize an actual council, a meeting of all the bishops, and Mar Papa is trying to take that lead. And so then Achen gives there's a lot of detail about how the back and forth. Mar Papa calls his meeting, and there are some who don't like it and oppose him, and there's some divisions there. And it says that one of his archdeacons and other bishops were not in favor of that. But then later, Mar Papa gets the support of the bishops who are outside, on the border and just outside of the Persian Empire, and is able to make a kind of an agreement that he should be seen as the leader right now, the first leader, and then the one who was put as the rival one, he promised him that he would be he would succeed him once Mar Papa died. And so that's what happens. This Simon Barsabo is who was the rival, the rival candidate for Catholicos at the time when the church in Persia is trying to solidify its place. He becomes a second Catholicos, and that's just kind of detail, just showing how it's not a natural, because kind of everyone just kind of came together and they should make one person. Just like in everything in life, just like we think in a church Buddhogam or a sub as a whole, with the kind of difficulties that we have, even in the early time, there was this back and forth, but the church community recognized there was a need. There should be an overall leader to kind of help support the growth of the church, and especially at this time, someone to speak for them on behalf of this government that is not Christian and kind of looking to kind of control them. And so then, one way it's okay as long as they're allowed to worship, but then knowing that there's someone needs to speak for them. So then that's why we have the first Catholicate being established in the Persian Empire, and the Catholicos from then on in Persia are functioning from that point forward. This is from the 4th century. So like this, the early 300s, this is all happening. And so that's what this is the detail that's coming in this section, how different Catholicos are being raised during different times of Persian emperors. And just like in the Roman Empire, there are some emperors who are supportive, and there's those who are who are against, and there's a lot of persecution of them. One of the people that we can mention the emperors that was cooperative is it says, like, when there was peace amongst the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, that was actually a good time amongst the Christians, because especially in the Persian Empire, because even as it says here, the emperor in Rome sent his son, asked the Persian emperor that, can you send someone to help teach my son, because there was at that time there was great teachers of learnings, but in the academics, and someone to teach them. So then his son Theodosius II was learned to have peace with his neighbors, and so have good relations with the Persian Empire. And so because of that, we also see that there was a greater acceptance of Christians within the Persian Empire because of that relationship, because they saw the son who was taught by a Persian as being friendly to them and have good relations, and didn't, so the Persians didn't see the Christians as enemies, because that's the religion of a foreign empire's religion, but they saw them as, okay, that's the empire that they're in good relations with. And so that's what most of this part of the section is about. And then then becomes the section where it says, later we start seeing, as the church is growing in the Persian Empire, we know that there's different councils that are happening within the Roman Empire. And so we never really see that any synod decisions, these ecumenical councils that bishops in Persia are really attending. But later down the line, when these minutes or these decisions are being made and kind of being disseminated amongst the Christians about like the Nicene Creed, and how we understand who Father, Son, Holy Spirit are, they're being taught and being brought up. We see that the church in Persia is either accepting of those decisions and those practices and those teachings, or they're rejecting them based off of their understanding and of their relation to the people involved with the dispute. And so that's what this main thing is about, how, like this actually in 410, the Maratha who came to Persia, he's coming from the Roman Empire side, asking the formal position to hold a synod for the Persian church, and he's trying to tell them about the decision of Nicaea, particularly the creed, that this is something that's supposed to be universal, because up until that point, the Nicene Creed, there was no Nicene Creed until after the Council of Nicaea, and formalized and completed the Council of Constantinople. And so when this Christian bishop from the West, from the Roman Empire, comes to Persia and tries to get them to also be on board, and to tell them, hey, there was this meeting and this great creed being made for all Christians, it's being formally adopted by the Persian church because of its really good relations at that time, in the end of the 4th and beginning of the 5th century at that time. And so then that just shows the friendly relations between the Christians on both sides. Maratha was a Christian from the Roman Empire, so the Antiochian side, and not from the Persian side, but coming in and being accepted as a fellow Christian, and sharing these teachings that formalizes what's already been the tradition, and now it gets formally adopted in the church. And then we get this last part: what is a Catholicos, meaning one who represents all. Whereas patriarch means the chief of the fathers. And as Achen mentions, patriarch was being more used in the Roman Empire from about the 5th century, and Catholicos was used within the Persian and the Armenian Empire from the 4th century onwards, and also our church in India a lot later. This next section 4, about the Antiochian efforts to influence the Church of Persia. After sometime when they're by the 4th and now 5th century, we start seeing differences within these regions of practices within this Christianity, both from the Roman side and the Persian side, and then so their influences on each other, particularly how the Roman Empire Christianity is influenced or tries to at least influence the Christianity within the Persian side, and so then that's only it helps to start solidify as the years go on, the differences, and where we start seeing separate churches. And right now it's still considered as the same church. That's why they're trying to, they're the same church, but slowly different influence and different practice slowly start making hard and fast differences. And so when we get to this first point, By the 4th century, the church, like we said earlier, the church formally adopts Trinitarian understanding of God, meaning Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and Christ is the incarnate Word of God. Also, it is during this time, during the 4th century, that within the Roman Empire, monasticism it takes a deep root within Christianity, and it becomes like a foundation of the church within the Roman Empire, which begins in Egypt and spreads into the Middle Eastern parts, like where the Antiochian church is within the Roman Empire. There's great ascetics there, and then going into where we know is like Constantinople, and then also in Greece, and then also into Rome. Monasticism takes root strongly, but it's not so much in within the Persian Empire. The Christians within the Persian Empire, that monasticism is not taken up as such a big a spot within the Christian community. It's not part of the life of the church. It's just people can, but it's not a big part of it. Like it's growing now within the Roman Empire. The only thing it says at that time within the Persian Empire, there was a monk named Eugene, which is how we get that in Sureni. In Syriac, it's Algan, who comes from Egypt and starts to propagate monasticism within the Syrian Empire, also within Syria, a border which is between the Roman and the Persian border. But it doesn't take strong root within the Persian side. Within the Syrian side, it does. Or sorry, within the Roman Empire side, it does. But within the Persian side, it doesn't. But at least they know of it, right? It's slowly being there. And so as we start saying, we know monastics means that they're not married. They take the rule of celibacy, and they live in lots of times they live in communities. And so this is a kind of, we're starting a little bit a difference. We'll see later. It starts developing a bigger difference within the Syrian, the Roman and the Persian Christians. Whereas it says in the Syrian Christianity, the Roman is very keen that the church life should be based on the monastic way, and became the rule. They were hoping to make they were hoping she'd also become the rule itself within the Persian church. So that same Marutha who came to Persia, he didn't take up the issue. He only just focused on the Nicene Creed, and that's what we mentioned a little bit earlier. But by 420, it says a group, an envoy or kind of like an ambassador, like we think like ambassador, envoy, we think of ambassadors like from for presidents and countries. This is also envoy from the Roman Empire, which is now Christian. They come with some bishops. This is the religious envoy, and meet with the Persian synod, and they start telling them about the different decisions that are being made. There's the 3 ecumenical councils. These are the saints of the church, the bishop we accept. These are the kind of considered the heretics. Our church is kind of the practice of the church is that we should now be more ascetic, meaning monastic, and be upholding that. Whereas within the and it's kind of presenting, it says like the ascetic way or the monastic way is superior to the married life. That's kind of what was being presented. But it says that when the synod was met amongst the Persian synod, that wasn't accepted, and it's a thing, or in the sense of they never saw as monasticism or asceticism should be forced as a practice, as a discipline. That should be left up as a vocation and kind of voluntary. And so once they start saying that's kind of what's being as the standard of Christianity within the Roman Empire context, and now they have a difference of opinion that they don't feel that should be the standard for church life, then that's where it says here, this is where the council starts asserting its independence in clearer terms, now saying that they're not just going to follow whatever they say coming from the Roman Empire side. They're now strongly rooted within the traditions that have been growing within the Persian Empire. And so now the Catholicos there and the synod within the Persian church are asserting they're no longer to be dependent or looking towards the West to see how to practice church life. That's the main thing. There's no longer accepting, because just a few minutes before, or so a few years before, just like a decade and a half before, when they accepted Marutha and said they liked the teaching of the Nicene Creed and things like that, and they say, oh, that's just something we share, and very happy to receive it. Now then, when they start saying something very, because they accepted the Trinity and the things that were coming from there, but once this hard and fast rule about monasticism and how they're dividing up the world amongst the different patriarchates and things like that, then they start saying, we need to show that from the Persian church shows, it kind of declares on its own its independence. And so that's how we see the development of the Catholicate happening within the Persian church, particularly at this point in history here by this 424. And it says, as it says, there was 36 bishops under the presidency of Catholicos. I don't know, this is Dad Jesus. It's not Dad Jesus. But this is, I think it's a misprint. I forget that it's not Dad Jesus. There's another way it's said, but it has a title, a name within the his name. But then they refer, they don't take any account for interference, like it says here, that the council takes no account of external interference. So then they're saying they're now their own church. All right. Okay, now in this lesson 3, now we're going to focus now more on how the Persian church becomes known, is considered now the church of Nestorian, is Nestorius, or the Nestorian church. So to give some background on that, we have to go back a little bit. We know back into the Roman Empire. We know that around the beginning part of the 5th century, this is in the year 424. Sorry, and 424, this is the middle of 5th century. This incident happens where there's a controversy within the church, particularly the Roman church, the church in the Roman Empire, about how do we understand who Christ is in relation to the Mother of God. And so there's a belief that there is a tradition of calling Jesus Saint Mary, the Mother of God, because we believe that Christ, as I said from the Nicene Creed, he is thus word of the Father, second person of the Holy Trinity. He's true God of true God and all those things, but also perfect man. He's God incarnate, and so it's proper to see Saint Mary as the mother, or have her called as the title of the Mother of God. Whereas there was a different opinion within the tradition that says it's probably better not to call her Mother of God, because God doesn't have a mother, but we can call her the Mother of Christ. She was a mother of the, particularly just more of the human side. That's what she bore, right? The human person. God was already there. She didn't bear God. It's better just to say that she's the bearer of Christ. Though even though Christ doesn't necessarily mean the human part, but they felt that's the better term, just to kind of let people know we don't mean God began in the womb of Saint Mary. That that in the end, that's really what they're saying. That was their main point, that God is from the beginning, and he takes root in the mother in Saint Mary, or takes flesh from the mother Saint Mary, and then he is born, right? And she bears particularly the God part. But then the church at the time, especially the Patriarch of Alexandria, which is Saint Cyril, or Patriarch Cyril, but who we call Saint Cyril, defends vehemently that it is proper to call Saint Mary the Mother of God, because if Christ is fully God and fully man at the time that he's conceived in the womb of Saint Mary, that means she's bearing God himself. And so that it's not wrong to call her Mother of God, because God is being born through her. Like it shows how much he is willing to descend to be born of a young girl. And so he said it's proper to show that, because it exalts Saint Mary to a high status, yes, but at the same time it highlights that God was willing to descend that far, right? And so that's where the Orthodox view, especially with our church, also accepts that it's proper to call Saint Mary the Mother of God, the Theotokos in Greek, or in Soriani, Yeldas Aloho. She is the Mother of God, because God incarnate is born of her, right? And so this is being defended by Saint Cyril, but then the Patriarch of Constantinople at this time is Nestorius, and he is of the view that it's probably not good to call that, and he's coming from the Antiochian school. So that's what even Samuel Achen in this book highlights, and we learned this even at seminary. During this 3rd, 4th, and 5th century, there's 2 big schools, or like you can think of seminaries, 2 big schools of thought or teachings within the Christianity. There's the Church of the School of Alexandria and the School of Antioch. So the Antiochian practices or traditions, and the Alexandrian side. And so the way we can kind of see it is, like within our Malankar church, we say there's the Deccan traditions and then there's Vatican traditions, right? There's people in the northern side do some things a little bit differently how our church people in the southern parts of Kerala do. So in a similar way, the way that the church is being taught, the bishops or the teachers in the Antiochian side, as they're teaching bishops and priests and deacons and all these things, are these young these people in the faith of the church. They have one way of looking at it, and the Antiochian tradition has a different way. And so one of the key things was this Mother of God versus Mother of Christ. And so Saint Cyril's is the, both of them are patriarchs, and so the emperor calls this council of at Ephesus, and Saint Cyril's the one who's considered the winning side, and that's his view is the Orthodox view, and Nestorius' view of saying not to call Saint Mary as Mother of God or the God bearer. He's now listed as a heretic, right? And so that causes a division within the church, right? And so right, so then Nestorius is kicked out, and then and as it says in the lesson, and I forget where it is, which paragraph, it'll say later, or in this next section, even Nestorius wasn't the one who was the originator of this teaching. He's also learning this from his teachers from within the Antiochian tradition, and it's actually even at this Council of Ephesus, and later these teachers of the Antiochian tradition are also listed as heretics, but they're coming from Antiochian, which is in the schools of Edessa, Nisibis, that we talked about kind of last time. These are towns that are on the border of the Roman and the Persian Empire. These churches, and these Christian centers in this part of the world are being trained. Are their leaders, their bishops, their priests, their lay people are trained within this Antiochian tradition. So they're not seeing why their teachers are being condemned. They're not understanding why that's not their side is being kind of condemned. Not so much that they're staunch defenders of that. It's just a matter of this is from the tradition, the view of how their practices are. And so there's a big fighting between these two, right? And so then even after Ephesus, then the title of Saint Mary is solidified, but then it becomes a question, well then, how is Christ both God? How do we define Christ as both God and man? And so then we get the Council of Chalcedon at 451. So from this 428 to 451, we see this big back and forth, and Nestorius is now is exiled, and the teachings of what's considered Nestorianism, which was actually not his teaching, but he was the person who got condemned at the Council of Ephesus. They're all lumped together, and so the people within the Roman Empire, they have the Nicaea Constantinople in Ephesus, and that's going forward. And then those who are outside of it, those who are outside Roman Empire, particularly the Persian Empire, are not fully accepting of that, because they're not. They are seeing it as just their traditions are being discounted or overlooked, or being looked down upon. That's the word I'm looking for. Because of their tradition, kind of like sometimes we might, like I said earlier, like we don't trust, or we don't say we don't know those Vatican traditions or those Deccan traditions, kind of things like that, even within our own Malankar church, right? And so that's kind of where that's going. And so as it says in the next section, the efforts of the Nestorian school to promote its tenets, like I said, the Antiochian traditions was based in the school of Edessa, but and Antioch, but not just Antioch, but also within the Christian centers and cities in that region. So Edessa is being one of them, which is in northern Mesopotamia. And then, so we have the two teachers of this teaching of that. It's probably better to call Christ, St. Mary as the Mother of Christ, is this Diodor of Tarsus and Theodore of Mopsuestia. They die before all these happen. Like Diodor of Tarsus dies in 402, Theodore of Mopsuestia dies in 428. But it's their teaching that's that is the foundation for this Nestorius. And so their writings are being destroyed in Roman Empire side, but they're being accepted within the Persian side. That's what pretty much we're getting in this section. And so slowly that we start seeing that division and start seeing why there's this animosity of the Persian church now wanting to separate from the Christians of the Roman side, because now it seems like their traditions are being looked down upon or being thrown out, and they're only accepting what's on the Alexandrian side. And just as a side, kind of also when you learn in seminary or when you learn about the Alexandrian school and the Antiochian school, the Alexandrian school is very more focused on uh, allegory and seeing how and the mystical way of interpreting the scriptures, whereas the Antiochian side was more literal reading of the scriptures. And so you can see that also kind of affects the train of thought of how they're trying to explain these great mysteries of the church, how explaining how Jesus is both God and man, how Saint Mary can be called the mother of God, or just the Christ bearer, things like that. And so this back and forth. So like I said, that Council of Ephesus with Cyril and Nestorius. So after that's done, that's settled. But then later, when it comes to how we understand who Jesus is, both God and man, is he just of two natures, in two natures? There's in history. There's a second council at Ephesus, which is known as the Robber Council, and that's where our patriarch Dioscorus, which we consider a saint, who's patriarch of Alexandria, is presiding over a synod or this council. And there's a big fight, and then this patriarch Flavius of Constantinople, they're defending, is it in two natures or from two natures? And there's a big fight of these monks and these clergy people, and then the point where it says the patriarch Flavius dies. And so then there's a great upheaval. Now there's a great discord within the church, within the Roman Empire. And then they get the Council of Chalcedon. And then we know that's how our church, our Malankar church, which being part of the Oriental Orthodox of churches, now separate from the greater church, or there's a split between us and what's considered the greater part of the church within the Roman Empire. Whereas the patriarch Dioscorus is called out again to this council, but not as a fellow bishop, but now to give account of what happened at this other secondary council of Ephesus, where this big fight happened. And then they're having to defend these teachings of how we define who Christ is. And so with all that happening, then the Alexandrian school is now put on defense, and the Antiochian school technically is kind of vindicated this Council of Chalcedon, because now they have this in two natures, and the Tome of Leo, as it's mentioned in this book, how it references there's the divine part we can see of Jesus Christ and the human part of Jesus Christ, but both are, though we can recognize the two, we know that they're still unified. They make this long definition in Chalcedon of how the hypostatic union versus the like our church, like which is more based within the Alexandrian church, and the Christians, even within the Antiochian, the Syrian farmlands, or the countryside, I should say, so not from the countryside, they're of one opinion that it should be like Patriarch Dioscorus said. And then also what we call Saint Severus of Antioch, who's defending during this time, later, of about 100 years later after this, defending our position that it should be only of two natures, not in two natures. And so all this is happening. And so with all this happening, that's why within just the Roman Empire, that's why we can see now also this time that the Persian Empire is solidifying as its own independent church, because to get away from what's happening within the Christians of the Roman Empire. So that's why a lot of these dates where it says how back and forth of what do they accept as the teachings within the Persian church. So they accept, since they're outside of the Roman Empire, they're accepting what's considered by the Christian within the Roman Empire as Nestorianism. They solidify that's their church tradition. That's the tradition that's been handed down to them, and that's what's acceptable to them. And so that's what it says by 470. By this time, the Alexandrians are also now being separated within the Roman Empire. There's the Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians, the Orientals versus the Easterns, all those different things. And so within the Persian church, there's this Bar Salma of Nisibis, who's not the same Bar Salma of our fifth event. They're trying to solidify with their school of thought, which is based off of in Edessa, and solidify the Persian church traditions, and showing that there's now there's two different sides, of what's happening with the Roman Empire Christianity and what's happening within their what they're trying to do as their own. And so And so then we see that this Bar Salma is one of the person of the Antiochian tradition, and he kind of goes within the Persian Empire and continues to propagate the Antiochian tradition as it is. But at the same time, as we get back to within the Persian church and the Catholicate there, we see that the Persian emperors is now liking as how the Christians of the Persian Empire are separate from the Christians of the Roman Empire. He likes how they're different, and they're so that they can really better accept them as not as just spies or as foreigners or accept Roman people within their borders, but actually Christians who are separate have their own ways of doing things. Though they have a different religion than the majority of the people of the Persian Empire, but they're not fully of the same ilk or the grouping of the Christians within the Roman Empire. So the Persian rulers like this this division, because then it also helps to see it helps to show that the Christians there won't just kind of do whatever the Christians in the Roman Empire are doing. So then that's why, and even the Christians in Persia recognize that too. They won't be persecuted if they stand on their own. So then that also kind of adds to why the Church of Persia is separate and independent. They assert their independence and do things on their own. And so that's how that's where we see the growth of the Catholicate within the Persian Empire. But with all that being said, just like we said, because these Persian Christians and these Syrian Christians that are on the border of these two empires, they all use the same liturgical language, which is Syriac. There's different varying dialects, and we know both Western and the Eastern dialects of Syriac, but they're both there. And so just because the Christian Persian Empire are, for the most part, are the majority of them are solidifying as separate from the Christian Roman Empire, just like in anything else, there's a pocket that says, we like the Christianity of our brothers within the Roman Empire, because it says for the most part these Christians living within the Persian Empire are not ethnically Persian, but they're more actually either Roman, Greek, and this Syrian, and so they identify more with the Christians within the Roman Empire. And so now they set up bishops and churches within their own context, and so that's what we get in this paragraph, talking about in 486. And so the provinces in this area slowly, they're going to start setting up a separate kind of parallel Christian group within the Roman Empire, Persian Empire, but they're not as big, but they're there. That's what we get later by the 13th, 14th century, when we have this Bar Ebra writing his church history, and he's we'll see it later, he's the Marfan of the Takrit and things like that. That's coming a little later. This is getting its foundation during this time, that the communities are slowly separating. The majority is Persian as independent, but there's a handful there even within the Persian Empire who still self-identify as being more in line with the Christians of the Roman Empire. And so then that's when we start seeing a rival Catholicate being started later. But it's starting with these communities who are separate. Their churches, their priests, and the bishop they accept are different from the ones from the majority of the Persian Empire, of the Catholicate of within the Persian capital. Okay, and so then the key thing that it mentions that in regards to faith, what the major differences are in reference to the incarnation of in two natures versus from two natures. The Nestorian side likes the Chalcedonian definition saying from in two natures, because it helps to define that. Then we can say that Saint Mary just bore the Christ, and so they like that. So then, though they like the Chalcedonian definition, but the Christians that are closer to them are those of the Alexandrian tradition and the Jacobite Antiochians, who are should be from two natures, and only accepting the first three ecumenical councils. And so we see this little bit difference between the Nestorians, or the Persian Christians, and the Syrian Christians within the Persian Empire. In regards to discipline, it says the Christians within the Roman Empire, because of monastic influence, now have the position that bishops should be celibate. Priests need to be should be celibate, but if they can be married as long as they're married before their ordination, things like that. And then if and priests shouldn't if they become a widower, they shouldn't remarry. But within the Persian church, they saw those as vocational thing, that marriage shouldn't be a something that excludes people from the priesthood or the or even the office of a bishop. And so the Persian church rejects those decrees of the Christians of the Roman Empire, saying that forced celibacy is wrong, and it should be, as it says, it should be a chosen vocation. Sorry, that it might though it might be a chosen vocation, it was dangerous if it was made compulsory. Meaning, if you force somebody to be unmarried, just to be a priest, kind of like they do just within the Roman Church, they decree that from priest onwards you have to be celibate. Or if you make that a rule for the bishops, that can be very dangerous if you make it compulsory. So then that's what the Persian tradition was. Our Persian church's position was, we don't have that. We won't accept those traditions. So that also kind of separates them being more different from the rest. And then that's we start seeing the more defining this Nestorianism, or this Nestorian church, and that's what, as we know, as which is the Church of Persia. And so the section 4 is kind of what I just already kind of mentioned, the Antiochian partisans within the Persian Empire. It says that the 628, 629. So this is like 7th century, when the Patriarch of Antioch, which is the Syrian Patriarch Athanasius Gaballo, he consecrates Marutha as the great metropolitan of the East. That's the first time we see this title of the Syrian church in Antioch assigning somebody for the church in Persia, like an official title. And so then, especially this title of Great Metropolitan of the East, and if some of you are mindful that if you look, especially within the Cananea community in their diocese, I don't think the current Cananea Theodomeni, the main Theodomeni, has it, but the previous more severe Theodomeni, when there was just the one diocese, was given the title. He's the Great Metropolitan of the East. This is in line with this during the 7th century, when it was given to this Bishop Marutha, when he was given charge within the Syrian Christians within the Persian Empire. And so they take up his seat in the city of Tikrit, or Tikrit, but now currently, if you see in maps today of Iraq, it's Tikrit. And so he becomes the leader, kind of the Catholicos. And later they start calling him the Catholicos of the East of the Syrian Church. But the official title is this Great Metropolitan, and later also this, as it says, where Eber writes, he's the first Mafren of Tikrit, right? And so from that point forward, that's where you can start seeing a line of succession of the what we call like the Jacobite, or we know as the Orthodox side of Christians being within the Persian Empire, from the 7th century, meaning the 628, 29 going forward. We see the Church of Persia now having two communities of Persian Christians who adopt Nestorian interpretation of the person of Christ. That's where I get this here, and also and who also don't accept this practice that only the clergy have to be unmarried or be married before ordination. We start seeing these delineation, or the strict defining moments of separating our practices that are differing the two groups. So as concludes this chapter, from the 7th century, the Nestorian Church of Persia evolves into a great missionary church, because now they're on their own, right? They've fully defined themselves by this 5th and 6th century, and so by the 7th century, they are now a fully, no longer like looking to the West no more. They're not getting anything from the Western parts of Christianity. They're moving on within their context and doing great missionary work. That's, like I said last time, going from India to China, and we see their influence within history, especially like I said last time, along the Silk Road. There's churches and converts along that path within India and then leading into China by these Persian Christians, right? And so and they continue up until the 10th century, and then when Islam becomes on the rise and slowly starts taking root in all these places, then the Persian church slowly uh, uh, contracts quickly, pretty much, until where they're no longer the great church they were from the 7th to 10th century. They became a very big, expansive church with great influence. By after the 10th century, it slowly contracts, and that's really when Islam is really big on the rise in these places, and then that becomes the main religion of these places. But that's where we get there, right? Does there any questions? I know I just quickly went through those two lessons. Before I get to lesson 4, is there any questions there? Because I'm going to try to finish this unit if I can get to, and so the next time we can start unit 3 by next class. I'm hoping to finish this lesson today. If not, okay, I'm going to get to lesson 4.
Yeah, proceed, Acha.
Okay. If any has questions, like at the end, I'm hoping to leave time before you wrap up. Go there. So lesson 4, the main thing is now, with all the background, the information of history that it kind of quickly went through, and now we're starting to see how those Persian, the church has connections, the church in India, right? So then, as Achen, as the book, this lesson starts off, it says, there's the historical writer Cosmos who bears witness that by the year 520, there's the existence of a bishop of Kalaya who had been consecrated in Persia, right? So that he's the first one, right? It is possible that this bishop came to India from the Persian regions even before 520. But tradition has it that the colony was led by Thomas of Cana, had a bishop, Joseph, in it. Therefore, the theory that the Indian church was founded originally by Nestorian missionaries cannot be admitted. Yet, historians of the Indian church have to face the question as to who may have sent bishops to India subsequent to the Church of Persia adoption of Nestorianism by 586, right? Sorry, 486. And so the main thing is saying, like, once the Church of Persia is formally now Nestorian by this by 46, there's that synod where accepting all the different teachings and kind of goes on its own, like we kind of talked about earlier. We start seeing that as the church is greatly moving and has a missionary outlook, and like I said, they're going along the Silk Road. We have to be mindful that the bishops that we say that are coming from this Persian connection, for the most part, should be considered as Nestorius and as Nestorian, because as Achen highlights that, by this, from 486 until about 628, this he said was a period of about 142 years. This what we ended with earlier, just in this last lesson, the Syrian Christians of Persia, who are more in line with the Antiochian Patriarchate, they're never formally organized as a strong community up until this, 628, 629. So from 486, when the Persian church is now more firmly Nestorian, until about 628, there's only a handful of people. So they're saying that if any bishop is coming with a community, be it the Kanana people, a community who is now in India, that we believe by the 3rd, 4th century, or maybe even later, and there's a connection there. If there's bishops coming at any time during that, or connection to that time, the only logical thing, if you're looking just by just numbers and by the proximity of our church to the closer to the Persian church rather than the church Christians in the Roman Empire, it makes more sense that they're most likely Nestorian. That's the point that is being made here. So that by when it comes about between this 5th century to about the 16th century, when we're trying to figure out the question of who's coming and supporting the church in Kerala, particularly Malabar Church, we have to be of the opinion that they were most likely Nestorian. That's the kind of the point. Even though there are some historians like that, as V.C. Samlachan writes, that this E.M. Philip, who writes a book which is more, as we would say, more Jacobite leaning or point of view, we can't say none of these bishops were just either indifferent or in the middle. We don't know for sure, but it looks like that it was the Persian church which was more mission-minded. They're the ones who were making a lot of connections and spreading quickly, like I said, from that 6th to the 10th century. So we can only assume with high probability that anyone that came during that time was fully Nestorian. And then even after that, if any Christians kind of came up until the Portuguese coming, and then we're looking for someone to support us, and that, like we talked about before, the Kunan cross, Satya in the 1665, that's the only time we start seeing an Antiochian presence, being the Syrian Christians of Antioch, of the Antiochian tradition, of the Patriarch of Antioch. That's the only time we can really say that that Orthodox or Jacobite position or teachings, that West Syriac tradition, that's the only time we can fully say firmly that's when the Church of Malabar was fully engaged with that type of tradition, with the patriarchal tradition versus the Persian Catholic traditions of the church in Kerala, or church in Malabar. And so when we look at it, the historical records, as Achen writes, that when we look at the historical records, even when Bar Ebra, who was the Marfan into Crete, and he's writing his church history in the Ecclesiastes, which was mentioned last time, he never really mentioned his writings about the church in India directly, or any strong connections with the church in Malabar, even though he was the Catholic for the Patriarchate side. That's never really mentioned. And this he's writing but in the 13th century, so doesn't say much there. So that's one thing, that they're not mentioning it. But when you look at the Persian records, starting from the 7th century, 628, the Nestorian Patriarchate, Esau Jacob III mentions had grown extensively and all the way to the borders of the Indian Church, and that their metropolitan of Warwickshire, which is the capital of Fars, which is in far part of the Iraq, current day Iraq, they had jurisdiction which is called part of India. Even later, after succeeding him, this Patriarch Esau Jacob the third, I think it should be fourth. The next one after him, Esau Yahab the third. That's what's different. They write that the metropolitan of Warwickshire has relations with the church, and their jurisdiction had great connection to the church in of India. So that when they're writing, when Metropolitan Simon, who is the bishop there, the metropolitan there, violates canons, it says that the Patriarch or the Catholicos wrote him that he closed the door of episcopal succession to the face of the many people of India. And he's the bishop of this Warwickshire, and that he has interrupted the succession in India. So it's just the letter. So it affirming that the Persian Christians had a sense of the church in India, but we don't see that same kind of distinction in these older accounts within the Patriarchate side that's consisting in Kara or the Malabar. And also it says, as a location of Kahala that we mentioned earlier, are a number of reputed historians have identified it with Ceylon or even Kollam. It starts saying like this bishop of Kahala we mentioned a little bit earlier. Most likely it's within the Indian subcontinent, like either Ceylon, which means we know as Sri Lanka, or Kollam or Ceylon in British India. It highlights more that the Persian church had more connection with the church in India. And then later, at the 7th and 8th centuries, it says that the chief bishop of India had the title of the Metropolitan of the Great and the Gate of all India. It says that the Catholicos within the Persian Empire, which now by this time is kind of known as a Catholicos Patriarch, it said that he's now as he's solidifying his authority over the different, as the churches continue to expand. It shows that he's formalizing his role, like so that the Patriarch in the Roman Empire had his jurisdiction amongst his people, but the Catholicos of the Persian Empire, of the Persian Church, as it's growing, he says a lot more power. That they said that at least once a year they had to make contact with. They had always had to make contact, whereas the Patriarch in Antioch said at least once every year, because his diocese and the bishops and the churches that are connected to him, they felt comfortable that they said at least once a year you need to send us letters and send us updates about what's going on. Whereas the Catholicos in the Persian church, it says knowing that the church is very expansive, going all the way to going all the way even into India, it says that they only had to reply back once every 6 years. And so that shows that the Persian church recognized that their church was so big and that they have places so far away from them, be it India and even to China. Their bishops, the bishops in those regions, only need to reply back once every 6 years. Whereas even at this time, the Patriarch of Antioch at this time still had the rule of they should reply back every once a year, showing that if they really thought about if their church was that expansive and that far, they would have thought we need to give more time for the Christian descendant. So that's why I'm saying just practicality. It shows that within the historical record, they most likely never had a thought of bishops or Christians within these far regions within their jurisdiction, meaning the Patriarch of Antioch jurisdiction, whereas the Persian Catholicos, he had that sense that we have to give time because our dioceses are spread out so far away. We have to give more time because there's no email or even like express mail to send things quickly, mailing to send things, so they can give it time to come. And then later there's some other incidents that happen that kind of support that the Nestorian church was more solidified within or the Persian church was more solidified as Nestorian and had connections to the Nestorian faith or tradition or way of church life, and also how the Church of Persia, the Persian church, also have connections to the Church of India. However, like this fifth point, it says, talking about Timothy, who was the bishop, this Bishop Timothy, who was the bishop of Fars, which is the Metropolitan Warwickshire, who had the jurisdiction in India. They looked like they were trying to solidify the responsibilities of their church, and it's stipulating the bishop should no longer marry or eat meat or drink dress. It shows that he's slowly also now accepting more of the Antiochian Patriarchate side of teachings, because before, like we said earlier, the Nestorian side, they didn't practice, their bishops didn't practice strict monasticism. They said that shouldn't be forced upon any of the clergy. Whereas by the time of when Timothy is now the bishop of Fars, and now starts to kind of bring in these practices and kind of enforce them in India, it shows that now that's the first instance maybe that the Jacobite, the Patriarch of Antioch side has some influence within the Indian church. And that's the first kind of instance of it. But it's not for sure. Like I said, it doesn't necessarily imply completely for that. Also during this time in the 9th century, which it's kind of in the history of our church, there's this bishop who came, Proth and Sabriso. Most likely these were Nestorian bishops, but it's not for sure. We can't say for sure, but we can only imagine, because like we know that by the time the Portuguese come, they said most of the practices that they are coming into contact with are more Nestorian and outlook, and so that's why you see like this when there's churches in Kerala that had the name under these saints, these bishops who came, who were later called the saints, Proth and Sabriso. When the Portuguese come, they changed all those churches' names from these Persian Nestorian saints to just the Saints Church. Like they just take their names out to be more in line with the Roman Catholic faith. And so next we see that it's showing more that this is just the 6th point, just points out that as between the 10th and 16th centuries, as the Persian church is now being on the decline, and Islam is now on the rise, and the church now is kind of solidifying no longer in the capital of Seleucia, because now the caliphate is now in charge. It moves the seat of the Persian church moves to Baghdad, because that's where the caliph is now residing. That's the capital of the caliphate, and so then the leader of the Christians now moves their headquarters there, because just the Muslims also follow the same practice of the Persians. They allow for Christians to live there under certain strict conditions, and there should be someone to represent them all. And so then they move the Nestorian Patriarch or Nestorian Catholicos Patriarch shifts the their Aramana to Baghdad, because that's now becomes the capital of the empire, which is now Islamic. And so I'll go from there. So I just realized I missed two questions, or the one question came down. I missed one question earlier, about 20 minutes earlier. It says, someone asked, do the Syrians still uphold the ascetic life and is superior to married life? I kind of mentioned that earlier. I would say we don't say, not particularly, we still hold monasticism or monastic priests and bishops kind of to a higher standard. Just if you look at our church in India, we give so much importance to Rambans and Triminis compared to the married Achens, or you can say to a certain level. So even the same thing in the Syrian church. I don't say they say it's better. Like, I don't think they'll ever say superior, but they say it's a higher calling, and so we give a little bit more important. It's kind of special importance to them. But when you look at the traditions amongst all Orthodox churches, we recognize that we never say that monasticism is the better vocation than married life. Both are vocations. You're either called to be married or you're called to be as monastic. Just as yesterday I was at a wedding, and one of the Achens, Achen, who was giving the message, he kind of highlighted that in the marriage ceremony, we read from that same Matthew's Gospel, chapter 19, where when Christ is talking about the calling that man and woman are called to be as one flesh, and they have to have all these, they should never divorce except for unfaithfulness. And so then the disciples better not to marry then. And then Christ said, well, that's only for those who has been given. So it means that both are difficult. Those are both are forms of discipline. Both are disciplines of the church that require great calling and sacrifice. Both be either to be married or be to be as monastic. So though sometimes we kind of highlight the monastics, or the ascetic life is kind of a higher calling because they gave up family life, but recognizing the church as a whole, when you look at the fullness of the church, both from the full Orthodox tradition of the Eastern Church traditions, which also include Nestorians, we recognize that the married life is not considered less of a sacrifice or less of a vocation of a Christian. And so we both, if you see in present modern day teaching, both are considered equally as a vocation of the Christian life, but equal in the sense of neither is necessarily higher than the other. Both are what you're called to, either one or the other. Now, just to what I talk about, this bishops who came, this suborn, like in our book it says prod. The main thing is, I'm not sure exactly which churches they are. I should look at, like Achen, it mentions in the Divyabodhanam book, those churches that were now called as just as saints, like the Kaddish Pali and Korlam, all those churches, all these Kaddish Palis, for the most part, as V.C. Samlachan is highlighting, those were probably initially, when they were first constructed, in these names of these saints, of these bishops. But because of their Nestorian connection, or supposed connection, because some people say they weren't necessarily Nestorian, but when the Roman Catholics came, they changed the name of those churches to just the Saints Church, and not mention these men, because they know they couldn't completely change it, because then people probably would revolt. They just called it the Saints Church, or Kaddish Pali. And so that's most likely, most of those churches were named after these two bishops who came from Persia, but later the name of the church was changed just because of the Roman influence that came later. Continuing on, the next section, it talks, continuing about the connection of the Church of India to the Persian Church. This says the deputation from India for bishops in 1490. This is one of the first when these the Portuguese first come. They're now trying, they heard there's Christians there. They're trying to make an avenue. The Portuguese are wanting to make connections with the church in India because they want to control the spice trade. They hear there's Christians there. They want to make good relations with them, but also propagate the Roman Catholic faith. And so the church is in need of bishops, and it's not necessarily that the church definitely called them, but the Church of Persia actually knows that there's a need for bishops. There are presence of clergy there. This says in 1490, a 3-man delegation was sent by the Indian church for bishops by the Nestorian patriarch, because the church is knowing we need people, right? And so as a result of the political change, it says that they had to go to Baghdad, right? And so then they ordained both of those, two of them who actually made it. The third one actually died, to the patriarchate. This Persian Catholicate patriarch. He ordains two of them as priests and sends a bishop with them, and says this is the kind of at this time in 1493. But then by the time the Europeans and Portuguese now have a stronghold, they've come by around the same time. They start controlling who comes in and out, and so that when the next the patriarch, meaning the Syrian patriarch, Catholicos patriarch, succeeds, and they need to send somebody in more clergy, they need to go to India and to China to support the church there. It says that that these men were who were being sent, but then one of those, these Indians who are actually in Persia, or when they get sent to the western part, they get, to my understanding, they get taken. It doesn't say here, but it says they're taken by more of the European authorities, the Portuguese, and so that one of these Indian priests who were sent by the Persians is now later comes back as a Catholic bishop, and that's the one that says, where's the name? Bishop Joseph, I think, right? Yeah, Mar Jacob continued in India, right? So then, and so it's kind of he's kind of supported by the Portuguese at the time, and so that just kind of shows that connection there. And I think finally, this lesson 5 is the last one of this year. Let me just make sure. All right. Yeah. Okay. This last lesson of Unit 2 is about the Persian. Oh, sorry, no. There's one more after that. Lesson 5 is about the Persian crosses. I don't want to take too much time. The main thing is, we know by the 8th and 9th century, there's these carvings of Persian crosses in India. So we know in Mylapore, there's the cross mount. We know that in certain churches. I forget what does it say the churches are. Oh yeah, so in Valiapoli, in Kortam, and there's another church. I've heard the other one. I don't know if it's Chiriapoli or if it's the other church. They have these Syrian crosses inscribed on the pillars inside the church in stone, and it says it dates back to the 8th and 9th century. It has the Bahaveli language, and it's talking about the cross. It says, the translation here says, "In punishment by the cross was the suffering one who was a true God above all," and so that's what they believe that the language is saying, and so just talking about highlighting the cross, right? And so we see these Syrian crosses these Persian crosses with these inscriptions dating back to the 8th and 9th century, highlighting the Church of India, or the Malankar Church or Malabar Church, its connection to the Persian Christians. And so how authentic or how original they date back to is kind of in dispute a little bit, or which one is which. And even the practice, why would they put crosses in the altars on these walls, is kind of, it doesn't necessarily point to one particular tradition or how it date back to a certain time. But as Achen mentioned, it is assumed that all this was until the 16th century, that these Persian crosses were affixed to the walls within the church. He says that this custom has since changed then, and the stone cross was put on the pedestal in front, meaning kind of like I believe like the Qurayshim would in front of the church, no longer inside the church, but outside. And so that's what we get those remarks. That's where we get this. The Persian crosses are integral to show a connection of the church in India. The Malankar Church and the Malabar Church having connection with the church, the Persian Christians, but that's the main thing. And then finally, for this unit, some customs and doctrinal traditions. The key things was we see that, like we kind of already talked about earlier, about the monastic life, or the requirement of celibacy versus a married clergy, including even bishops, to practices within the of Nestorian faith or not, or a Roman faith or Jacobite faith. Those are the key things that are highlighted in this section. says, when the first European visitors visit India in the 13th and 14th centuries, particularly beginning with Marco Polo, they're sending people because they're wanting to make these relations to these peoples and these spice, the Asian areas because of the spice trade, and also wanting to make connections from what they hear from tradition, being these Christian communities in those areas. And so even Marco Polo testifies in his writings and his catalog, or his travel log, that when he went to Mylapore, he went to the tomb of Saint Thomas, but it says that though his bones weren't there, because it was transferred to Syria and then later into Europe. But the Christians are still venerated the spot of his burial. That even both the Christians and the Muslims would go on sacred pilgrimage there, and it says that they would take the dirt from there for the healing of their people. And then once the Portuguese come and solidify their presence there, that the Pope, the Roman Pope, sorry for the background noise, this baby's crying. The Roman Pope is sending different orders, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, different Catholic monastic orders for conversion and for building up the Roman faith or the Roman tradition within India. One of the first missionaries that was sent to India was this John Monte Corvino. He's kind of an important figure. On his way he continued all the way to China. He did stay in India for just over a year, and he testifies to the existence of Christians in India. So that's why he's kind of important to the church, this church history lesson of our Indian church, because he writes back that he stayed there and visited these Christian communities. And then it says later the Pope, the Roman Pontiff Pope John the 22nd consecrates Jordan to be Bishop of Ceylon in 1328, but he cannot come back to India as he died in Europe. So it says that while Jordan was in India, there came another missionary, and his name was Ordonic Pedrone. He's the one that kind of writes, when you get his writings talking about the Christians there are Nestorian, that there's Christians, but they hold on to, as he writes it, violent, pestilent heretics, meaning Nestorian faith. And then later that we have a Bishop John Marignoli, who also comes to Ceylon in 1346. And he stayed there for 16 months in India. And so this is just showing slowly that by these European missionaries, that's what the section is about, and visitors, when they come, they're not just coming with no Christians there. They're always their writings back to Europe or to the Pope or to their superiors is always referring to the community that's already there. And they pretty much always mention that the faith that they see of these Indian Christians is of Nestorian faith. And so that when we get to the Synod of Udayampur, and it formally forces the Church of Malabar or the Malankara Church to be under Roman rule. When we look at the minutes of that synod, it highlights certain things that they know about the church, what the church was at that time in Kerala. The Kerala Christians had a respectable standing in society, but as the Romans saw, they had various defects. Most important of all, they had a lack of the faith and what the Christians professed. They said many of them did not know how to say the Lord's Prayer or Hail Mary by heart. And as these Roman missionaries saw that the Christians in India or Christians in Kerala were not properly trained in the Christian faith. They also saw that they saw it was customary for mothers to stay away from the church for 40 days for a male baby and 80 days for a female baby. And so they would wait only after that time to baptize the children. The Synod of Udayampur decreed that this delaying of baptism should be stopped. So the Roman Church had already, within the Orthodox tradition, meaning not just in India, but even just in general, but even from Greek traditions all the way through to our church, there's the churching of the baby at the 40 days. That's just that we see that in the Bible. Even in Jesus was brought to the temple after 40 days. So that's a practice that was there, but the Roman Church slowly stopped adopting that, but saw that delaying baptism after all this, 40 days for boys and 80 days for girls was not good. And so that's in the minutes. So then that's the change that they also saw. It says that another thing that they mentioned at the church already at the time of the Synod of Udayampur, A lot of places had more than one Achen or more than one priest, and they all had special honor. And they just had the seniority was by age. There was no vicar or assistant vicar. They were just senior priests, and then just going down. But all were equally respected, and the income for the priests by the church was divided equally among the priest. Memorial services were done for the departed, and then the other thing says for Achen's Putan Gurbana was celebrated ceremoniously, and it says both Christians and non-Christians alike honor the clergy. And then the last part, or second last part, some doctrinal traditions that they saw, being how the men were Nestorian. They said that when the prayers of the church, they saw the Nestorian influence, that when they would say the Hail Mary prayer that was being said by the church there, and the Hail Mary, instead of saying, "O Mother of God," they said at that time, it said, "O Mother of Christ," rather than "O Mother of God." And so that was there to show that Nestorian influence. It also showed when they were making the Qurban Appam, they used oil, and more importantly, they used leavened bread versus unleavened bread. We know that with the Roman Church, they saw that as bad, and they said that was a Nestorian, but really that was more of an Orthodox thing or an Eastern way of celebrating Holy Qurbana. Also, in addition to that, like I said, the Church of Malabar had all from bishops down, all had married clergy. Where the Roman Church, they was all unmarried, all had to be celibate from deacon up, or priesthood up, right? I think even deacon at that time, they were all had to be unmarried. So that was considered a big difference when the Portuguese came. And finally, and then one of the other ones was hearing confessions. Before receiving communion was not enforced at the time. That was always a Roman practice. And that is a kind of part also of the other Eastern Orthodox churches practices, but that wasn't a practice of the church in India up until that time. It wasn't formal like that. There was confession, but it wasn't mandatory to do before every Qurbana. But when the Portuguese came, that became a practice, regular confession. And then it says finally that by the time the Portuguese come, they slowly but surely, after seeing all these different practices, were able to organize communities in which they saw, but then they got them to start adopting more Latin or Roman rites for the church. All right. So the last thing, as it concludes, the conclusion is that does the Church of Malabar have any connections to the Syrian Church of Antioch? As Achen highlights, this book highlights, there's no clear connection, particularly the Church of Malabar had any direct connection to the Syrian Patriarchate or the Western Tradition Church of Antioch in any way until after the Portuguese come. So before that, when bishops came from, is most likely from Persian connection. That's where we get most of it. And then also at the same time, there was no connection to the Roman Church up until the Portuguese come to Kerala and to the Malabar coast. And so, and that's also highlighted that up until then, even though there was these minor kind of connections and always through the Persian church, and also more closer to the arrival of the Portuguese, or at least especially when they're first coming, there's no direct connection, even though the Roman church will say the Church of Malabar was always under Roman rule, even if they didn't know it, kind of thing. It showed that there was no understanding of that up until the time of the arrival of the Portuguese coming for spice trade and sending missionaries at the 15th and 16th century, right? But these lessons highlight, for sure we can show there's connection to the Nestorian or the Persian church, though it's not as direct and has like direct meaning, direct rulings or direct kalpanas or like specifics at every century and at all times, showing like a unbroken line of succession. But it shows it highlight the lessons, or sorry, the different things we highlighted, the different bishops who came, the different writings of bishops to the bishop of the metropolitan of Fars or Warwickshire, which is the tip of Iraq or kind of Kuwait area. It showed that they were seen as having charge over the church in India through the Persian Catholicate. Those connections kind of point that there was always community in Kerala, and that they had connection more through the Persian side than anything else. So that when the Portuguese do come by the 15th, 16th century, there's a church community there, and they were seen as being Nestorian, because more than anything else, because of their Persian connection. That's pretty much what this unit 2 is trying to highlight more than anything else. Okay, I know it's 6 o'clock. I know, like, I was trying to my best to kind of get this unit done for today. I know I tried pretty quickly through it. I'll get some time for questions if anybody has, and then I think we'll wrap up because it's already getting late.
Yeah. There's nothing on the chat that I can see. If there's anything else, please feel free to unmute and ask the questions.
Okay, I got another question. Why does the church not allow remarriage of widower priests? So by the 16th century, after the Romans come, and then after our church is now firmly more of the Syrian patriarchate side, the church with the Christian church within the Roman Empire, like I said earlier, by that 5th century when 4th century, 5th century, when monasticism becomes a foundational part of the Christian life of the church, or the life of the church, the Christian church. So be it Roman, the church in Rome, even the Greek churches and the Coptic churches, it becomes a practice that the leaders of the church, especially particularly bishops, should be chosen from the monastics. That I think is a better way of administering, and they have more focus for it. So that, and then even for priests can be, so in the Roman church, they say none of the clergy really should be married. But in the Eastern church, they say, well, priests down can be married as long as they're married beforehand. But they made it a rule of it's better not that priests should marry afterwards, because if you look at the scriptures, St. Paul says, if you're a widow and you're able not to remarry, it's better to stay like that. Now because of the more kind of importance given to the monastic life, it says if a priest wife dies, it's better for them to remain unmarried. Though the priest can be married, but then there's a lot of rules for it. But it's always best to not marry. And so that's because that just became, well, that was one of the I forget what, there's a synod, there's a ruling on the canons of the church. It says that's the better practice, and so then our church follows that rule. When we are firmly more Persian, connected with the Persian church, there was no stipulation for that, or a hard and fast rule for that you couldn't remarry. Even Achen didn't even have to be married before ordination; they could be married afterwards if need be, because they saw it as fine. But then at the same time, especially for modern times, it's always seen better that priests should be married beforehand. One of the reasons, on a practical level, so that they don't, priests don't abuse their position within the community, in propriety, or trying to use his position to get married to somebody as a way of getting married after being ordained. Because as Chamachans, people say, oh, this person will be an Achen later, and so in that sense, it's kind of there. But afterwards, it's seen it's not good to do that. So like I said, so in our church, it's generally, we know when we get ordained, both Achen and even the Kwachamatu, they're told, if you're not to remarry, that's the practice that, both, not just Achen, but even the wife is also asked, and they're told to her before the ordination of the Achen, the Chamachans, or getting married, and also before the priesthood ordination, to remind them, hey, we don't remarry. But there's instances, especially when they're, one of either Achen or the Kwachama dies when they're small children. There's a provision for either one to ask the synod permission to remarry because of the need of the family. And then I've heard it's rare; you don't see that too often. But when it does happen, you see that provision given for the Achen or the Kwachama to remarry. Particularly more for the Kwachama for sure. Anytime when there's children involved, I've always heard they'll allow for a remarriage. But for the Achen, when it's with small children, I know they allow for remarriage. But if it's older children, most times the Achen don't ask either. At least I haven't heard. They don't really ask when it's older children, when they're kind of close to already being on their own. But like I said, I've never heard. I don't know how the synod decides how old is too old or too young. I don't know. But that's the only instance I've heard where Achens are allowed to remarry. In that sense, when there's still children involved and they need to help with the family life. But that's that practice. Any other questions? If not, I know they're getting late.
Yeah, let's close it.
Okay, is Sandosh Sachin online with us, or?
Let's see.
I don't think he's usually ads comes at the end.
No, he had some other callers.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, yeah, 'cause, yeah, we have a church prayer.
thank you.
All right, so let's close in